Duncan's Christmas Carol, an audio story based on Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Duncan is a grump. Every engine knows that, and he will grumble about anything under the sun. He would grumble about being overworked. He would grumble about not being polished enough. And most of all, he would grumble about the passengers. And this time of year, Duncan would be at his worst. Duncan never liked the Christmas season, because all it meant for him was more passengers, which meant more work and less polishing. One winter morning, Duncan arrived at the first station, the bitter cold weather matching his bitter cold mood, as usual. He waited impatiently for his passengers to board, when Skarloey pulled up at the other platform with his passengers, smiling from buffer to buffer. "Good morning, Duncan," he called cheerfully. "What's so good about it?" Duncan scoffed. "It takes so long to get steamed up around this time. I can't stand it. It's the coldest time of year, all these passengers are slowing me down, and I've barely any sand left in me sandbox. I expect there won't be any left in the yards either." Skarloey had heard these complaints from Duncan before. It was nothing new to him. "But everyone is so happy this time of year," he said. "Just look." Duncan looked over to see two children running towards their father, who had two large gifts in hand for them. They were packaged with the appropriate seasonal wrapping paper and had shiny big bows to top them off. To the children, it was the most magnificent sight they thought they'd ever see. The children hugged their father tightly, and they begged for the exquisitely wrapped presents, eager to find out what was inside. Now, their father said, "you must wait until Christmas Day to open these. Now come on, we've got to go see your mother. Maybe we could bake Christmas cookies together." The children beamed bright with joy at this idea, as all three of them began to board Duncan's coaches. But Duncan was being impatient. He didn't like waiting on the passengers. He blew his whistle loudly at them and insisted for them to get on board. The father gave Duncan a stern look, and the children's smiles faded. But Duncan didn't care a bit. The father still tried to keep the holiday spirit as he patted his children's heads with a smile, and they began to board the coaches. "Bah, humbug," Duncan grumbled as the guard's whistle blew and he set off down the line, his wheels slipping on the icy rails as he did, which prompted another under-the-breath complaint about his increasingly low sandboxes. Skarloey was left disappointed and felt his holiday cheer drain from his boiler. When Duncan arrived back at the yards, he saw that it had been strewn with bright Christmas lights, and a Christmas tree stood tall next to the sheds. The tree, too, was adorned with ornaments of all shapes and sizes, and to top it all off, there was a big, shining star. But he didn't pay any mind to it. He thought it all looked silly and impractical. It was all so garish and ostentatious in Duncan's mind. Then he looked to his right and saw that Luke was idling in the shed, with a glum look on his face. "What are you doing in the shed, Luke? Shouldn't you be out getting work done? You know how busy we are around this time." Just then, Rusty sidled up alongside Duncan, who gave a look of compassion for the little green engine. "He's in the shed because one of his axles is broken," they told Duncan. "And because of how busy we are," added Luke, "we haven't been able to get a replacement in. The workmen said they aren't sure when they can even get a replacement in, and at this rate it may not be until next year." Duncan just rolled his eyes. "Suppose that means extra work for all of us, then," he groaned as he left the yards, leaving an upset Rusty and a distraught Luke behind. "I'm sorry about him, Luke," confided Rusty. "Duncan's always a bit of a Scrooge this time of year. I know that we can still have a Merry Christmas despite your broken axle." "Thanks, Rusty," murmured Luke. That evening, Duncan returned to the sheds, hoping for a good rest before another extra busy day tomorrow. But when he got to the sheds, he noticed something else had taken his usual spot in the sheds. It looked a little like Rheneas to Duncan, who looked sound asleep in his spot. This greatly bothered Duncan, who just wanted to get some shut-eye. "Hey, Rheneas, you're in my spot. Move, will ya?" The engine said nothing. Duncan moved closer to try and make himself heard, but when Duncan's buffers were just a few inches from the stranger's, its eyes popped wide open, revealing crusty, gray irises, glazed over with little signs of life to be found. Duncan jumped at the sight and closed his eyes in terror, but when he looked again, the engine disappeared. Duncan thought it best to get some sleep. He thought he was so tired that he was beginning to see things. He glanced over and saw Rheneas was in fact in his own spot. Duncan shuddered, but he didn't think anything else of it. As Duncan dozed off to sleep, he heard the sound of puffing and what seemed like the sound of a generator pumping profusely in the night. Duncan was confused and opened one eye. The sight that awaited him was horrifying. There, before Duncan's very eyes, was Smudger, the mid-soda engine that was converted into a generator due to his careless behavior. Where a boiler once was, there was instead a pumping engine, and his old, rotting wheels were missing their coupling rods. His face was as pale as the moonlight, with sunken-in and wrinkled features, and eyes that pierced through Duncan's own, as they looked to have no color behind them at all. Duncan was speechless, as the specter of Smudger stopped just in front of him. At last, Duncan found his voice. "What are you?" he stammered. "Ask me what I was," Smudger replied, his voice pronounced with echoes into the cold, misty night. "What were you?" "In life I was called Smudger, but you don't believe that, do you?" "Well, I don't. You're not supposed to be here." The ghost cried out, the pumping engine getting louder and louder, as Duncan wailed and closed his eyes tightly at the awful noise. "Ah! Apparition, what do you want with me?" Do you believe in me?" the ghost shouted. I do, Duncan cried. "But why do you torment me?" "I am here to deliver a message to you and only you," the ghost echoed. "For on this night you shall be visited by 3 more spirits. The first shall come within the hour, the next shall be when the clock strikes 11, and the third will show itself when the bell tolls at midnight." But I need the sleep. I have a busy day tomorrow. It is the wintry season after all. Can't they visit here and now and be done with it?" Smudger was angered by this notion as his generator cried out into the dead of night once more, sending a shiver down Duncan's boiler that made him shake with fear. "No!" Smudger cried out alongside his generator. Then there was silence all at once, and a few moments later Smudger continued. "As I continue to pay for my sins for the rest of my days, if you do not change your ways, so too shall you pay for yours forevermore." The ghost let out a shrill whistle as Duncan shut his eyes, praying that this was all some nightmare and that he would wake up the next morning with everything back to normal. Unfortunately for Duncan, his wish would not be granted. Duncan was struggling to sleep after his ghostly encounter and couldn't stop thinking about what Smudger had said. All that, coupled with the bitter cold outside that made Duncan feel as if he were turning into an icicle, he was plain miserable. Just then, Duncan heard a whoosh from outside the shed, and then he felt a warm sensation inside his boiler, which made him feel a little better. He opened his eyes to see where this was coming from. Perhaps his crew had decided to have a late-night bonfire where they could roast marshmallows and tell stories, but Duncan soon found out that that was not the case. When he opened his eyes, he saw in front of him a bright golden engine that appeared to be made of dozens of flickering lights, and its face was made up of a silhouette just like its body, with a small but welcoming smirk on its face. Duncan felt almost at peace with the silhouette, more so than he did with the Smudger apparition. However, he still felt a bit wary about any sort of supernatural spawn. "Who are you? Are you the first of these spirits I was told of?" he asked quietly. The silhouette spoke in gentle, soothing whispers, and replied, "I am indeed." "What are you called?" "I am the ghost of Christmas past." Duncan was puzzled. "How far in the past?" "Your past," the spirit answered. Duncan groaned at the very thought of this. "There's nothing in my past worth mentioning," he told the spirit. But the spirit just chuckled to itself. "Are you so sure of that?" it asked. "As sure as there's steam in my boiler," Duncan retorted, not wanting to entertain the notion any further. "Just follow me, and I will show you that your past is much more important than you realize." "Tell me how I am supposed to follow you. You are but a spirit, unbound by rails while I am tethered here. I surely cannot follow you as you ask me to." The spirit gave another chuckle and began to move towards Duncan. Hey, now, don't get so close. Duncan wasn't sure what was about to happen, as the spirit coupled up to him, and before he could ask how that was even possible, the flickering lights of the spirit unraveled and disappeared in a blinding light. Duncan shut his eyes tightly. When he opened them, he found himself perched on a hillside next to the spirit, not on the rails. Duncan began to freak out. Ah, no, I'm gonna fall, he cried. You needn't worry, reassured the spirit. You are now like me, not bound by your rails, sleepers, and ballast. There's no risk of falling. Now, do you recognize this place? Duncan looked around. He was so caught up in worrying about falling that he didn't realize where he had been magically transported to. He looked off in the distance. He saw Skarloey approaching a tunnel with some wagons and workmen. At the other end of the tunnel was Duncan with a passenger train. I'm a plain blunt engine. I speak as I find. Tunnels should be tunnels and not rabbit holes. This railway is no good at all, Duncan said from the tunnel. What? How can I be there and here too? That's not me. Who is that? Duncan cried out, but he got no response from either Skarloey or himself as he watched Skarloey drop off the workmen to the tunnel. They cannot hear you, and they cannot see you. We are revisiting your past, the spirit answered. Duncan looked closer. Why, this is one of my first days on the railway. I got stuck in the tunnel because it was too narrow for someone like me. That's not what I remember, the spirit said matter-of-factly. Don't be silly, came a voice. This tunnel is quite big enough for engines who don't rock and roll. It was Duncan's driver, scolding the stuck Duncan. You don't quite like listening to the words of others, do you? The spirit asked. If their word is true, began Duncan, I shall listen. Is that so? Inquired the spirit. Duncan did think this to be so. He was, in his words, a plain blunt engine. He felt no need for further explanation to the spirit. But the spirit thought otherwise, and once again the spirit began to unwind into bunches of flickering lights as another blinding light fell upon Duncan. When Duncan awoke, he found himself at the Croven's Gate station platform. This time he was safely on the rails with the spirit to his right, which quelled his previous anxieties about being perched precariously on another hillside. On Duncan's left sat Rusty and Skarloey, and directly in front of him was himself again. There's still a bad bit of rail just before the first station, Rusty warned Duncan. An engine could come off on it, so I suggest running carefully today. Duncan just scoffed at the little diesel. Huh, I know my way about. I don't need smelly diesels to tell me what to do. And Duncan puffed away, leaving a very hurt Rusty. Skarloey attempted to soothe their hurt feelings as the two engines watched the stubborn Duncan leave. You didn't seem to heed their advice, did you? The spirit said to Duncan. And where did that lead you? But Duncan tried to defend himself. So I may have been a little rude, but after my accident that day, I learned to respect Rusty. I learned that they're not like the other diesels. Did you continue to respect them after that day? The spirit asked, to which Duncan gave a very true to his character, blunt reply. Absolutely. The spirit rolled its golden eyes at Duncan. You have been watching these memories all wrong. You are remembering without learning. One more. The spirit glowed the brightest it ever had and took Duncan into one last memory. The two sat perched at the top of the quarry incline, and below them was Duncan with a line of slate wagons in front of him. I'll show that smelly diesel and those lazy steamers, Duncan huffed from the bottom of the incline. The spirit and Duncan watched as the other Duncan got pulled up the incline and subsequently plummeted down into the muddy pond at the end of the quarry. Duncan couldn't take it anymore, and he snapped at the spirit. What are you showing me these for? I know my own life like the back of my buffers. What can I hope to gain from this? So you can remember how all these memories end. Your ego gets the better of you. Your grouchiness disappoints those around you. Despite you claiming to have learned these lessons, you always seem to falter in the end, the spirit told him. So, Duncan sneered, that's just the way I am. You heard it directly from me. I'm a plain blunt engine, speak as I find. It's just who I am, whether you or the others like it. But it's not who you always have to be, the spirit answered as it flickered away, leaving Duncan behind, who at this point just wanted to be back in his nice warm shed, asleep and unbothered. But he knew there were more spirits yet to come, which didn't excite him at all. Duncan opened his eyes as he found himself back in his shed. He felt rather shaken, but tried to go back to sleep anyway. The spirit showed him so much. He remembered every moment, sure, but was unaware as to how these events shaped him, or rather should have shaped him so long ago. But he was sure he had learnt. After all, he did learn to respect Rusty, and yet to the spirit, it seemed as if Duncan had been in a stagnant position for years. But Duncan remained confident in his disposition. But before Duncan could try to get another wink of sleep in, the clock struck 11, and Duncan knew what that meant. In front of Duncan outside the shed, the next spirit appeared. He was also of a golden color, but this time appeared to be a full engine, with a headlamp that shone brightly in the night. The spirit, in Duncan's mind, almost looked like Sir Handel, but its face was much more full of life than Sir Handel's would be. The spirit was decorated with a Christmas garland with dots of cherry blossoms all around, and atop his funnel was a wreath crown, with the 4 candles of Advent aglow. Despite its size being similar to that of Duncan's, the spirit spoke with the booming voice of a gentle giant. Come over and get to know me better, little engine, the spirit bellowed. Duncan slowly puffed forward to the spirit, but despite the glowing, welcoming energy emitting from the spirit, for the first time in his life, Duncan felt rather shy. I am the ghost of Christmas present, said the spirit. Duncan was speechless as he gazed upon the beautiful sight of the spirit with the utmost reverence. You seem stunned. You have never seen something like me before, the spirit noticed. I have seen 2 spirits, but neither of them were as imposing or as grand as you appear to me, Duncan said at last, still in awe at the sight of the ghost. You are here to show me the present? I am indeed, said the spirit. But I'm already in the present. I can see it here and now. What more can you show to me? Duncan asked. The last spirit showed me so much. I'm still mulling over it. Maybe that means it's working. The spirit chuckled heartily. I think you will find that the present is worth so much more than you give credit to. After all, there are many who would say that today is a gift, which is why we call it the present. Duncan was slightly put off by the metaphor, but reluctantly played along with the spirit. Whatever you must show me, let me at least get something out of it, Duncan said. Follow me, then, said the spirit as he began to puff away. Duncan was confused. This wasn't like the other spirit who had whisked him away in a ball of light, but if it was in the present time, maybe there was no need. Suddenly, Duncan and the spirit arrived at their destination. It was the Sodor Steamworks. Duncan was now even more confused. They were a long way away from the steamworks, but their journey only felt like a few minutes had gone by. Inside the steamworks was Luke, who sat stationary on the turntable, Victor by his side. What have you brought me here for? Duncan asked. Just watch and listen, the spirit said. I assume they cannot see or hear us then? Just watch and listen. So Duncan did. Luke sat woefully on the turntable. Victor was most sympathetic to him. Oh, Victor, I wish I could be out there enjoying the seasonal festivities with all my friends. Instead, I'm just stuck here on my own, Luke said sadly. Cheer up, my friend, Victor soothed. Your friends know better than any engine that no one deserves to feel alone on Christmas, broken axle or not. Besides, I'm here for you. Thanks, Victor, Luke said, though he still wished he could see his friends. He enjoyed seeing Victor, sure, but to Luke, Christmas just wasn't Christmas without his other narrow-gauge friends. Just then, to Luke's surprise, all the other narrow-gauge engines flooded into the steamworks, some of them carrying a wagon with some sort of Christmas decoration. Luke was speechless. Even Victor had not been privy to the idea that the others were planning this sudden ambush of holiday cheer just for their friend Luke. Skarloey was hauling a truck of tinsel ready to be strung. Rheneas carried in a flatbed of presents all shapes and sizes. Sir Handel pushed a truck of baubles. Peter Sam had a glowing yellow star. And Rusty, last but absolutely not least, pulled in with a tree that towered over them, a tree that was ready to be adorned with all the previous decorations from the others, and on board Rusty was the thin controller. Luke's face beamed with a smile so wide he felt he could almost burst with joy. Inside his boiler, he felt warmth from the kindness of his friends. At last, he spoke up. "You guys, this is incredibly thoughtful of you all. I don't know what to say." As Luke looked around at the splendid sight before him, he noticed someone was missing from the congregation. "Wait, where's Duncan?" he asked. "I'm not sure," Peter Sam answered. "He wasn't in the sheds when we left." "Knowing Duncan this time of year," Skarloey added, "he likely wanted to escape the festivities, and so he left for a different shed, one that isn't as exposed to the bitter cold like ours." "A pity, I'll admit, but it's not exactly out of character," Rheneas went on. "He thinks Christmas a humbug, after all." "I've no patience for an engine like that," Duke interjected. "At least an engine like Sir Handel will still join in the festivities, even if he isn't always a fan of this busier season." Sir Handel rolled his eyes, but gave a smirk at Duke's remark. He was right, after all. As much as Sir Handel would gripe like Duncan, at the end of the day he wouldn't want to spend Christmas with any other engines. "Now what are we waiting for?" Rusty finally said. "Let's begin setting up." Immediately the engines shuffled their wagons into place as their crews unloaded the decorations. In no time at all, Luke had decorations of his very own to enjoy. "Merry Christmas, Luke," said the thin controller. Duncan watched all of this, a forlorn look on his face, which the spirit took immediate note of. "Oh, Luke, the poor engine. Tell me, spirit, that Luke will get his replacement axle in time?" Duncan asked with an interest he had never known before. I see many months passing without an axle," the spirit replied solemnly, "and soon the cold weather shall wear away at him, getting smaller and smaller, until there is but a vacant berth at the sheds." No, it can't be," begged Duncan. "Say it isn't so." "If these events remain unaltered," the spirit said with pity, "there shall be one less engine in the sheds. But what does it matter to you anyway? After all, for you it just means extra work." Duncan winced as he felt the bite of his own words being spat back at him by the apparition, and all at once he became stricken with a grief never known before. The spirit brought him to a lone part of the line, and Duncan stared up at the ghost, with sorrow welling up in his eyes. The candles on the ghost's advent crown suddenly extinguished, and the spirit disappeared, leaving the mournful Duncan all alone. Duncan, for the first time in his life, felt a single tear make its way down his cheek. At this point, the clock struck midnight. One last spirit. Duncan closed his eyes and braced himself, awaiting the grand entrance of the final apparition. But instead, when he opened his eyes, the spirit was already there. This spirit was different from all the rest. It was out of Duncan's gauge, and it towered over him. It was a rusty, old-looking engine with 10 drive wheels, a tapered firebox, and large boiler. It was cluttered with cobwebs all over as it inched its way towards Duncan. Its hoarse and deep puffs echoed throughout the valley. It had no face nor smokebox door, just a dark, hollow void of endlessness that sent chills down Duncan's boiler. The phantom engine's buffer beam stopped just a few inches from Duncan's buffers, for there were no buffers to speak of. You must be the ghost of Christmas yet to come," Duncan shuddered in its gravely presence. The phantom said nothing in reply. "You will show me events that have not yet happened, but will happen in time. Is that so, spirit?" Yet again, nothing. "Tell me at least, what will happen to Luke? Tell me that he may be useful again," Duncan pleaded with the spirit a third time, desperately hoping for an answer that he knew would not come. And yet he asked anyway. The ghoul let off a billowing cloud of dark smoke, which Duncan didn't know how to interpret. Although he had been through the spirit shtick before now, he feared this silent, blank specter far more than the previous ones. And when the spirit began its deep, hoarse puffs again to beckon Duncan to follow, Duncan's wheels wobbled with a most eerie sense of dread throughout. The ghost took Duncan back to the sheds, where a very miserable Skarloey and Rheneas were. Presently, Rusty arrived, a look of grief written all over their face. Duncan watched in pure silence. The thin controller stepped out of Rusty's cab, walked into the sheds, and in the dark it almost looked as if he hung something up on the wall. And as he climbed back into Rusty's cab, Duncan could see tears welling up in the thin controller's eyes. Neither Rusty, Skarloey, or Rheneas exchanged a single word with each other. They all just gave sorrowful, knowing looks to one another. "Spirit, please, give me something, anything," Duncan pleaded. The spirit just floated over to the shed and stopped in front of its entrance, which prompted Duncan to do the same. Duncan turned his lamp on so he may see into the shed, and on the wall there was a plaque, and when Duncan got a closer look, his heart sank into deep despair, for the plaque read, "In loving memory of Luke." Duncan suddenly felt more tears welling up in his eyes. He had no words, just an exhale of misery. Tears began to rapidly flow down Duncan's face, as if a dam had burst inside of him. Oh, Spirit," he said at last. "I never wanted this to happen. Luke is young yet. He doesn't deserve this. Please, I beg of you, tell me that these events can yet be changed." The spirit then let off more dark smoke, taking Duncan to a lone siding, where rusty parts of scrap metal surrounded them, and in front of Duncan there lay an engine, whose identity was not yet known to Duncan, but all around him he felt a sense of eerie familiarity. "Spirit, I don't wish to look. I can't bear to see Luke in such a state," Duncan grieved. The phantom would not take that for an answer, and so it gave Duncan a light bump, to which Duncan reluctantly began to look down the siding, as the light from his lamp enveloped the scrap engine. The nameplate of the engine then made itself known. Duncan. He jumped back in horror, but found that there was no track behind him anymore, just buffers. The phantom had disappeared into the dark smoke, and a hellish red light illuminated Duncan's surroundings, as if the fires of hell and the scrapper's torch had come to visit right then and there to take their dues. "No, please!" Duncan wailed. Suddenly, a huge claw started to close in on Duncan from above, its razor-sharp teeth ready to swallow Duncan whole and drag him to his fate. "Please, I can change! I will change!" Duncan cried out in horror, his eyes shut tightly to prepare for the worst as the claw got closer and closer. Then there was a bright flash of light. Everything stopped. Duncan opened one eye. He was back in the sheds. Everything was normal. The morning sun was just beginning to crest over the mountaintops. "I'm home," Duncan said quietly to himself. He beamed bright with joy, a joy he had never known before, but a joy that he was most eager to let escape for everyone to see. Sir Handel then entered the sheds, only to be greeted by this new Duncan. "Oh, there you are, Duncan. Where have you been?" he asked. "Sir Handel, just the engine I needed to see. Tell me, what is today?" It's Christmas Day. Why?" "Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. There's still time. Oh, the spirits have done it all in one night. Of course they have. It was just like Smudger had said. Oh, yes." "What are you talking about? Are you all right in the smoke box?" asked Sir Handel. "Am I all right? Never better, Sir Handel. I feel like a young engine again, ready to take on the world, merry as a schoolboy on the last day of school. Oh, I better get going. So much to do, so many people to see. Merry Christmas, Sir Handel. Merry Christmas!" Duncan shot out of the sheds like a jackrabbit and blew by Sir Handel, whose eyes were filled with utter confusion. He was at a loss for words. He thought Duncan might have finally snapped and gone mad from the busy winter season. As Duncan sped down the line, he ran into Skarloey and Rheneas, who also took note of Duncan's unusual cheeriness. "Oh, Skarloey, Rheneas, Merry Christmas to you both. I wish you dry rails and smooth runnings. Meet me at the steamworks by tea time, will you? And bring Sir Handel." Duncan stopped quickly to exclaim to the old engines before tearing down the line again. Skarloey and Rheneas exchanged a surprised stare. "He's finally lost it," chuckled Rheneas. "I never thought I'd see the day." "I don't know if he's quite lost it," Skarloey laughed, "but something has surely changed in our Duncan." The next engine to be greeted by Duncan's newfound holiday cheer was Peter Sam, and much like the engines before him, he couldn't quite believe it. Peter Sam was shunting in the transfer yard when Duncan came whizzing through, and he stopped when he took notice of Peter Sam. "Peter Sam! Perfect! Oh, Merry Christmas to you!" Peter Sam was taken aback. "Duncan?" "It is me. I have a most important task for you." You do?" Peter Sam was most puzzled. "Our poor friend Luke is all alone at the steamworks with a broken axle. We all know this. I need you to rush to Croven's Gate Works and get him that new axle. I won't have it if they say they can't find a replacement. Oh, matter of fact, get a new everything. New wheels, a new dome, new whistle. Send it to the steamworks as a surprise. I'll greet you there with the others, and we'll make Luke feel like a new engine just in time for him to enjoy this most wonderful Christmas." Peter Sam agreed, though still puzzled, and Duncan raced away to find one more engine he desperately needed to see before the celebration could begin. He found Rusty not too far from the transfer yards, at a level crossing. They were waiting for the gates to open, but because of the cold weather, they refused to move. Their crew was trying desperately to unstick the gates. Duncan stopped beside the little diesel. "Oh, good morning, Duncan. Merry Christmas!" There was slight annoyance in their tone because of the faulty gates, but still the usual air of cheeriness Duncan would expect from the kind little diesel. Duncan smiled the biggest smile he had ever done, before finally speaking up. "Merry Christmas, Rusty," Duncan said with the utmost earnestness. "Now, I just came to say, I'm really sorry for the way I've been treating you for so many years. I promise to be better, not just to you, but to everyone around me. I've seen the way my actions, words, and demeanor have affected those closest to me, and how it stretches far into the future. I don't want to lose that. Truly, I don't. I'm not the engine I once was, and I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Rusty looked Duncan up and down, their crew still attempting to free the crossing gates. This was the most vulnerable Duncan had ever been to them, let alone any engine. But they could see that Duncan was speaking from the heart, and so they said, "Duncan, I forgive you." Duncan beamed brightly and his eyes lit up with joy. As soon as the words left Rusty's mouth, the crossing gates finally opened, as if to bring about a new start to Duncan and Rusty's newfound relationship. "Oh, thank you, Rusty. I don't know what to say. Merry Christmas. Now, follow me. I've got one last surprise for not just you, but everyone." Rusty was puzzled, but followed Duncan anyway. The two arrived at the Sodor Steamworks, where they met Skarloey, Rheneas, and Sir Handel, who were gathered beside Luke, as they all waited for Rusty and Duncan. After they arrived, they all waited anxiously for Peter Sam. Only Duncan knew what was taking him so long. But soon enough after Rusty and Duncan's arrival, Peter Sam proudly steamed in with a flatbed full of boxes of all shapes and sizes. "Peter Sam, you remarkable engine, you! I knew I could count on you!" Duncan erupted with joy. The other engines were all puzzled, especially Luke. "Duncan, what's gotten you in such a joyous mood?" he asked. "Why wouldn't I be? It's Christmas after all. In fact, I've got this surprise just for you." Luke was still confused, as a few of the Steamworks workers began to open up the various packages from Peter Sam's flatbed. "Merry Christmas, Luke." Luke's eyes widened in surprise as the workman brought out his replacement axle. But before he could say anything about that, they brought out a new dome, a new funnel, a new safety valve, and much more. With each new surprise, it looked as if Luke's eyes would burst from the excitement. "Listen, Luke, I'm so sorry I was, and have been, so very rude to you. I've learned that the way I act and the things I say can have a serious impact on those around me. So, as a little surprise, I had Peter Sam deliver this to you on my behalf, and soon enough, you'll feel like a new engine again. And to everyone else, I solemnly swear that from here on out, I will be a better friend. You can count on that. But for now, let's all enjoy the holidays while we still can." And Duncan was as good as his word, if not better. Never again did he complain about the passengers, or not being polished, or about feeling overworked. Rather, he took the time to be thankful to those most important to him. For the other engines, it took some time to get used to this new version of Duncan. Some thought it wouldn't stick. Some placed bets on how long it would be before Duncan reverted back to his old ways. But these bets would be nothing more than null and void, for Duncan would not just keep Christmas well, but all year round he would stick to his promise. Of course, he has his moments of being grumpy now and again, but not once did he truly forget what the spirits had taught him that night, and everyone, not just Duncan, was all the better for it. The end.